There we go. My name is Meryl. I work at NAMI Juneau. So if you have any questions today, you're welcome to send me a chat and I'll try to get you sorted. This presentation today is part of our Inside Passages speaker series. So if you registered for this today, you've either maybe been to the first one, this is the second in the series, or maybe you're registered for ones in the future, but we do have some. This is 2 of 6, I think. And so we're really excited today to have Amelia Hanrahan here to talk about trauma stewardship and preventing burnout. And I will let her introduce herself a little bit more. But thank you all for being here in the middle of a very chilly Tuesday. And thank you, Amelia.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. So hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So yeah, my name is Amelia Hanrahan. I'm talking about trauma stewardship, both the book and the idea today, and about preventing burnout. So a bit about me. I'm a mental health therapist. I work for the Juneau School District. Right now, my work is focused on childhood trauma, suicide prevention, and LGBT mental health. I'm originally from Toronto and I moved to Alaska in 2016. Another thing to know is that adorable kid was up puking all night, so I'm running on like 3 hours of sleep. So I'm sorry you're not necessarily getting me at my best functioning, but I'm going to try my best. But yeah, that's me and Matilda at one of our favorite places, the ice rink. All right, so let's get into it. So first off, I wanted to put the resources that I'm largely drawing on up front here. And there's going to be a few other things, but my main 2 things I pulled from for this presentation were Trauma Stewardship by Laura Lipsky and Laziness Does Not Exist by Devin Price. I also am going to read a bit and use The Heart of Trauma by Bodhi Badenoch and some ideas from The Politics of Trauma by Stacey Hines. I think these are all super cool, interesting books, especially the 2 large ones. I can't recommend them enough. They've been really, really helpful to the way I approach and do my work. Oh, I also meant to say off the top, if you have questions, you can feel free to ask them throughout. I know Meryl there watching the chat, so you can also put them in there. I'm happy to answer as we go. It helps me think about it and like maybe come back to things I rolled over. So feel free. Okay. So first off, I wanted to start with like when we talk about, not getting too basic, but when we talk about trauma, what are we talking about? And Badenoch in her book, The Heart of Trauma, has this really nice vignette that I think shows pretty clearly what we're talking about here. And so you can just settle in. It's going to be like 2-minute story time here. She says, leaving her mom at the door, 4-year-old Mandy walks confidently into her preschool classroom and is immediately met by the screams of another child as his mother walks out the door. Her brow furrows, her stomach tenses, her shoulders hunch forward a bit. Understandably, no one notices, and she jets out the door onto the playground. Joyously jumping onto the swing, she pumps hard, heads for the sky. Her brainstem likes the rhythm, and her nervous system begins to calm a bit. Slowing down, she glances over at the jungle gym and sees 2 boys who are her friends wrestling over who gets to go first. They're pretty high up on the apparatus and aren't playing so much as fighting. No one gives in, and the shoves turn to shouting and hitting. By the time the teacher is able to separate them and bring them back to earth, Mandy is wide-eyed and shaking inside. Again, no one notices, so she's left to manage her fear by herself. As she walks back into her classroom, another friend offers to share her toy, and they wander off together as Mandy's conscious mind forgets about the boys tussling, while her body continues to hold the tension. At snack time, still enthusiastically talking with her friend, Mandy accidentally knocks over her cup of juice. She feels her overwhelmed teacher's frown and impatience flow into her small body as the teacher brusquely cleans it up while talking to another child who doesn't want her apple. Mandy's little chest caves in a bit, her eyes go down as she drops from joyous to quiet, enveloped in a small whirlpool of shame. Things are apparently peaceful for a while until circle time arrives. She sees the two boys who are fighting get close to each other again, both their faces frowning, and her heart speeds up. She looks around to see if the teacher is watching them, but she is helping another child put her things in her cubby. Nothing happens between the boys, but Mandy continues to watch them closely just in case. All this happens in the first 2 hours of her day. She's explicitly encoded all these experiences, although they go quickly out of her conscious awareness as soon as a new encounter arrives. So if we multiply those 2 hours times 3 times, we begin to get a sense of her 6-hour day. When Mandy gets home and discovers her anticipated playdate has a cold, she dissolves into a tangle of grief and rage, without in any way diminishing or dishonoring, the devastating trauma so many of us have experienced. Is it possible to say that Mandy has had many small, potentially traumatic experiences during her day? And so she uses that vignette to sort of cue up this, I think, useful definition of trauma for today, which is really looking at it as any experience of fear or pain that doesn't have the support it needs to be digested and integrated into the flow of our developing brains. And so I really wanted to start with this because, of course, it's a much broader definition than you're going to read in the DSM or like on the APA's website or anything like that. And it really views it as a spectrum response. You can even see it in Mandy's day, right? That she has different levels of responses to different stimuli throughout. And so when we think about our traumatic stress response, it's the way I'm going to be talking about it is as part of a spectrum of responses that don't begin at PTSD, but lead up to PTSD and through it. And so that leads us into, okay, so the trauma exposure response. This isn't an idea unique to trauma stewardship, but it's integral to it. And it's put really well by Rachel Remen. She says, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And so our trauma exposure response, of course, happens when we're exposed to suffering and exposed to trauma and loss and people who have experienced trauma, and we are trying to help them heal through that trauma. And the ideas that Lipsky in her book, Trauma Stewardship, really outlines is the idea that we're getting wet, right? And very rarely do we have a towel to dry off. That very rarely are we doing the things that actually let us heal and take care of ourselves. In fact, a lot of the times and in a lot of places, we are expected to ignore the fact that we got wet, right? Just go back to work, dripping wet is the idea. And so a big part of her book and her approach is how do we draw our attention back to the impact that our work is having on us? And if we accept it and acknowledge what's really happening, what is an appropriate way to respond to that? And that appropriate way to respond might be kind of radical, and we'll get to it, but it can be a significantly different way of doing things than has always been done. So Lipsky, we talk about that trauma exposure response. More specifically, what is it? Well, she identifies 16 specific symptoms. Not going to talk about them all in detail or anything, but just to go through them quickly, is of feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. One that you see a lot is the sense that you can never do enough, and that's a symptom that we're going to talk about ways that it gets exacerbated. Of course, hypervigilance, diminished creativity. I find when I talk with other professionals, that's often one of the things they notice, and the things that actually bothers them the most is they feel that the burnout is causing them to lose their ability to think creatively, to think outside the box. They're losing their tolerance for uncertainty and these other things that breed creativity. which is related to our inability to embrace complexity. Of course, the more burnt out you are, the more exhausted you are, the less you can think creatively, the less likely you are to tolerate and take in nuance, complexity, and all that stuff. She talks about minimizing, which is our basic straight up CBT, minimizing chronic exhaustion, and chronic physical ailments. That burnout leads to these things. It leads to an inability to listen, and deliberate avoidance. So, of course, deliberate avoidance can look like avoiding coming into work, but she also talks about how you often see behaviors like not answering your phone when you very well could, right? Choosing not to, you just sort of look at it and let it go to voicemail, or looking at an email and thinking, I have 15 minutes, but I am not responding to it. I'm going to go do something else. I'm going to scroll Instagram. Like that, these things are symptomatic of burnout. That we have dissociative moments. We get a sense of persecution, especially in our work, a sense of like, admin's out to get me, or the system's out to get me, or that line of thinking, which might not always be untrue, but can also be symptomatic of a trauma exposure response. So guilt, fear, anger, cynicism, of course, all appropriate in certain contexts, but can be part of our symptoms here. Losing our ability to empathize, emotional numbing, increase in addictions, and then grandiosity related to our work. You might hear people who talk about their work as though it's the most important thing that could ever happen. And that this can be compensatory for the actual burnout that they're experiencing. Okay, do we have any questions about the symptoms or anything else so far? Okay. Okay, so moving into the next step, it's what are the things that exacerbate our trauma exposure response? What are the factors that make it hard to deal with in the current setting, or in most current settings, I guess I would say? Well, here I'm pulling a lot from Price's work, that laziness does not exist. And they identify structural contradictions in helping professions. So they'll always be sincere even when you don't mean it. I couldn't find where the quote came from. It sounds like Yogi Berra, but who knows? And so part of it is the coercive nature of work and the helping relationship. So he points out, in our society, the way we structured it, we need work to meet our basic needs in a remotely secure fashion whatsoever. Our healthcare needs, our food and shelter, and so on, like our very, bottom of Maslow's hierarchy needs. And we also have a social imperative that help be given altruistically and selflessly. And so in here, we have an inherent contradiction of, I am doing this work so as to meet my basic needs, but also I'm socially conditioned to believe that I am doing it selflessly. And that this inherent contradiction leads to an alienation from our motivating force of doing our work. And so what is that motivating force? Well, of course, anybody who's existentially inclined and read Frankl might think, well, everybody's got their own. Connie Burke, the co-author of Trauma Stewardship, suggests a different view of things. She says, like, the motivating force that we have in our work is really a fourth way, and she puts it in the context of the Viennese schools, right? Like Freud's will to pleasure, Adler has a will to power, then crib sheeted from Nietzsche, which is related to Schopenhauer's will to live. And then we got Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, the will to meaning, in his work. Connie Burke suggests a fourth possibility, that we're actually driven by a will to compassion. That she suggests that when we look at human society, the way that we interact, that we look at the history, the anthropology, and so on, that what we're really looking at is humans who are motivated by compassion and cooperation with one another. And that this is our motivating force. And this is why we're, so many of us, drawn to helping professions, that it's actually not just a passion of ours, it's not just an interest or whatever, it's really a core driving force of what it is to be human. And so if we're driven instinctually by this will to compassion, and then it's, I forget how Price put it, but kind of like he sort of gives language of like, it's sullied by, you know, the capitalistic demands of like salary and benefits and work schedules and so on, that this like creates alienation in our work, which also then is compounded when we are burnt out and we need time off. There aren't structures in our system that adequately address what would be an appropriate response, which would possibly be large amounts of time off, large amounts of help and therapy and supports, that we just don't have the resources allocated for that. The second compounding factor that Price identifies is like our social value, our narrative around worth and work. So pointing out that when our worth is defined by our work, it raises a whole lot of problems. That when we identify how valuable I am is how productive I am, how many things I get done, how many clients I can see, how many people return to baseline, and we can terminate counseling and shut the file and move on to somebody new and get down the wait list. That when that is how valuable I am, that now addressing feelings of overwhelm, feelings of burnout aren't just workplace problems. We're now talking about existential problems, that saying, I am overwhelmed, I can't do this, isn't just a question of like, do I need to reassess my caseload? If we have internalized those beliefs, it can become a question of, do I deserve to exist? What is my value in the world if I can't do this? And so we quickly get to a place where we are strongly motivated to ignore those feelings, to leave them unaddressed, because that is a terrifying prospect, that if we've internalized the belief that my value is my productivity or my work, and then we're saying, I don't know if I can do this work, it's not a small problem, it is an all-encompassing problem. And Lipsky has a nice quote of, if we admit to having a hard time, we might open a door that we won't know how to shut. And for a lot of people, it feels this way. So I had a client in session this week who said almost that verbatim. Like, if I open that door, I don't know if I'm going to be able to shut it. Talking about a related topic. Like it's for some people, when we've bought into that narrative, this is the headspace we can get into. And so Price has this really nice section and talking about his pet chinchilla, which, if I remember from the book, right, is the chinchilla's name is Dump Truck, which I think is just a lovely name for a chinchilla. But Price writes, he's never been productive in his life. I would never look at him and think of his life in terms of, has he justified his right to exist? He's not paying rent. He's not performing any service. And it'd be absurd to even think of his life in those terms. I think animals help us remember that we shouldn't have to earn our right to exist. We're fine and beautiful and completely lovable when we're just sitting on the couch and just breathing. And if we feel that way about animals that we love and about relatives that we love, people in our lives who we never judged by their productive capacity, then we can start thinking of ourselves that way too. And I think he's very helpful in pointing this out, that this is an assessment we almost only pass on ourselves. We don't think about the people in our lives by their productive capacity, defining their worth and their value to us. But a lot of the time we do think of ourselves that way. And it has these severely detrimental effects to our work. Which then reminded me of this nice quote from Bell Hooks of one of the best guides to how to be self-loving is to give ourselves the love we are often dreaming about receiving from others. And I think like the first time I read that, I thought it was trite and didn't really take it in, I guess. And then over time, I've kind of come back to it. It stuck around in my head. And because I think a lot of things make me think about it. Some of my own personal work I've done in therapy makes me think about this. It makes me think it's more true and less trite. And the work I do with students here in the school district, I mean, one of my, I think, most effective and most commonly used techniques is like the empty chair thing of like, if your friend is sitting in this other chair telling us a very similar story to what you were saying, how would you respond to them? Okay, why is that so different from how you're responding to yourself? Why does your friend deserve something different than you deserve? And we can always apply that to ourselves. You know, what do I wish I got from other people, and can I give that to myself? Instead of longing for it, can I actualize it? Can I do it myself? And when we think about ourselves in how we deserve to be treated, it's also helpful to think about, how do I treat other people? And am I giving myself at least the same treatment? Okay, so that kind of closes the section on what is trauma exposure response, how does it get exacerbated? And we kind of move now to the second half of what are some things that might help. I think all the things I'm going to talk about have research to back them up, but of course are tempered by how we do them, in what setting, with what allocations, and what resources, and that, of course, not everything helps everybody. And so I always say might help rather than things that help. And I start with workplace solutions, because I think that work-caused problems mostly need workplace solutions. You know, we know that if you have a very stressful work life, not just a particularly stressful day, but your work every day is high stress, you can mitigate that stress by going home and, you know, doing yoga, meditating, taking a bath. And that will help reset you somewhat, probably bring you closer to your baseline, certainly. But the research really suggests that the next day, as soon as you literally walk through the doorway into your work, your cortisol and adrenaline and everything else is just going to spike right back up to where it was when you left. And so what that tells us is, like, when we put self-care in a context of stuff you do outside of work, all we're doing is maintaining at best, or slowing burnout might be another way to put it. And that if we actually want to resolve these issues, they take structural changes, which are not always super welcome to hear, because pretty much all of them cost money. And that can often be an issue. So the number one, the thing that really has the most research bearing it out, is caseload. Frankly, the fewer people you see, the less impactful burnout and trauma exposure responses. And so by lowering caseload, we make things more manageable. I think in some places I've seen a shift towards this, but really the research still bears out that most people in helping professions are working wild hours, seeing way more clients than recommended. And this is the number one thing that would help, would be reducing our caseload. Number two, mentorship programs have been shown to be highly helpful. So that can look like clinical supervision, of course, but in other settings, it can just, so long as the mentorship is a place where somebody is emotionally safe, they can express their fears, their doubts, they can admit to mistakes and talk about how they want to correct them or what they want to do differently next time. When we can create a safe place like that, where somebody can healthfully engage with their work and examine their own shortcomings and examine their own mistakes, it can be really beneficial to preventing burnout. Three, of course, staffing. That, when we're understaffed, the work doesn't go away. It just gets passed around, and then people get more stressed out, and it exacerbates. So maintaining adequate staffing levels for the amount of work that we have is integral to doing this. Probably not surprising, and I know that it's been challenging for people to find staffing, and that's why I say, like anything else, it costs money. That, sometimes it means paying more, and that can be a problem. And so a lot of these problems at the end of the day, what they come back to is we need more money. All right, number four, training and continuing ed. The research also bears out that when people find training and continuing ed to be meaningful and helpful to them, it creates huge workplace satisfaction. And that when it's perceived to be useless or unhelpful, it has the opposite effect. It makes things worse than not doing it at all. Okay, so option 5, meaningful work. So there's a really cool book that, excuse the title, but is Bullshit Jobs, A Theory, by David Graeber. And he goes through and identifies the way in which people begin to view their jobs, as he puts it, as bullshit, that they're meaningless, that they don't think that they're having an impact in the world. And he identifies all these categories by which this happens. And you can quickly see how in certain settings, even helping professions, people can start to perceive themselves this way. They can perceive that they're ineffective in their work, that they have inadequate resources, inadequate time to enact meaningful change, to do meaningful work. And when that happens, people just mentally check out from their work. And number 6 is structured consultation and debriefing time. I want to emphasize here the structured part, that when the research also suggests that when this is suggested or recommended, it doesn't happen. And that it needs to be a structured expectation of the workplace that you debrief. And so when we hear debriefing, we often think of critical incident debriefing, which is not exactly what I'm talking about here, but rather we can do a daily debrief that helps drastically, in some cases, increase workplace satisfaction. And so there's a lot of different models out there. I think a lot of them probably work well. When I worked with the medical team to implement this at an old workplace at Canna, when I was working there, we came up with this one here, and it worked pretty well for us. And it was just 4 questions. We said, what went well today? What was the challenge? What are possible solutions to those challenges? Or some people prefer to ask it as, what would you do differently next time? And then, what was your favorite moment of the day? A basic bit of gratitude, or at the end. So in doing this, you can see it doesn't have to take very long. If there was some significant challenges that day, it might take more time. But on an average day, I would run this with a medical team of 5 to 6 people and it would take us less than 10 minutes. But our feedback that we got on the surveys from everybody was that they found it to be incredibly helpful to how they perceived themselves at work. And especially it changed those feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, because I now have a structured part of my day where I can verbalize the challenges that I'm having, and I can work with the team of people to brainstorm what could we do differently next time. And so there are sometimes, of course, there's challenges that we don't have good solutions to, but it still creates a perception of we're acknowledging problems and we're working our best with the resources we have to address those problems. And so this can be really impactful to people, but it really, I can't emphasize enough, like needs to be scheduled. There needs to be like, you were doing this at 12:30 for 15 minutes. Here are the people, here's who's running it. It's happening every day, like that level of structure. Okay, there is some stuff you can do on your own, other than you. So number one that Lipsky recommends is protect your mornings. And what she means by that is that we don't jump on to reading the news or turning on the TV or scrolling social media first thing in the morning. That really this is shown to, again, raise our cortisol levels, just overall raise our stress and cue us up for that stress to be exacerbated throughout our workday if we have high stress jobs. So she recommends a whole bunch of stuff. She's like, read a book, drink water, make a cup of tea or coffee, go for a walk, just sit and take some time to yourself. Any of these things, she suggests, are better than, what I do, which is immediately jumping on my phone and scrolling. And, and she says, and the research backs up, that that's not healthy, and it's something I'm working to change myself. So that's, it's very important. One, I found for myself, and I think the research bears that in. Number two, practicing gratitude. I suspect most of us, if not all of us, have heard about the benefits of gratitude journaling. In case anybody hasn't, it's a really effective practice that is shown to increase our satisfaction. It can be at work, but in all parts of our life. That our brains are wired for negative pattern recognition, meaning we notice negative patterns more often than we notice patterns of positive things in our life. And so by doing gratitude journaling, we're working against that, that system. And instead all it takes is writing down 3 things that you're grateful for that day. They can be small, like saw a pretty flower on the way to work. They can be big, like my partner was there and supported me through this really tough thing. It can be anything, but it's just that by literally like taking a moment to think about it and write it down, it has a significant impact that builds over time and can actually change our pattern recognition. And we start to notice more positive patterns. So it's a really, really, I think, powerful practice that I would highly recommend. Number 3, that Lipsky recommends is fostering humility and grace rather than hubris and judgment. She points out, I think, that a lot of the time as professionals, we have master's degrees and doctorates and licenses that tell us and tell other people that we are experts in our field. And in some cases, this can lead to a sense of, well, I know the right thing to do. I know the right way this can be done. I know how this ought to happen. And she suggests that, like, even in cases where that might be true, where you might be the most expert in the room, and you might actually know based on research and statistics, like what is the best thing to do, that actually we tend to have a lot more workplace satisfaction and a lot more healthful engagement with our jobs, when instead we step back, take some humility and some grace to just hear what other people are thinking, hear other ideas. It might sound like very simple, but she points out this doesn't actually happen all that often, that that can be something that she says you do have to foster, that it takes active work to be able to have that kind of humility. All right, number 4 is setting compassionate intentions. Lipsky talks about compassionate intentions as the way that some of the reasons that we choose to engage with our work. So she points out, like, instead of sometimes getting very self-critical and critiquing ourselves, that when we just reframe it as, how can I be more compassionate, if that is my motivating force for doing my work? What could I do differently that would more align with that goal? And that instead of focusing on, like, where did I screw up, if we just reframe it as, how could I be more the thing I want to be, it reduces burnout. And relatedly, she brings up self-compassion, which really is, in this context, the way that we talk to ourselves about ourselves. And especially in the workplace, it can be how we talk to ourselves about all the things that we do throughout the day. And so I put, like, become self-compassionate in 3 easy steps. Because I do think that if we do this, and this is, I didn't actually cite, this is kind of cribbed from, I think, nonviolent communication. Probably should have cited it, but we can be a lot more compassionate with ourselves if, instead of telling ourselves, I should have done this, I ought to have done that, why did I do that stupid thing, oh my God, I can't believe I missed this meeting. When we talk to ourselves like that, they point out, like, the result of it, the consequence, is merely self-criticism. That very rarely does change happen because I said, oh, I should have done this other thing instead. That it's not actually likely that I do that thing next time. That instead, all that is likely is that I critique myself and feel worse and become less happy, and that's it. Instead, if we look at the 3 steps, it's identifying what happened in as objective terms as you can come up with, just stating what happened. 2, identify how it made you feel. And 3, choose what you want to do differently next time. So, for example, instead of saying, I should have gone to my daughter's soccer game instead of working late, there all I've done is criticized myself. If instead I said, I missed my daughter's soccer game when I chose to finish notes instead, that made me feel guilty, sad, angry with myself. Next time, I will prioritize my daughter's game over finishing notes. So here I've identified my values, I've identified what happened and how it made me feel. I've made a commitment to change and to do something differently. And nowhere along the way did I make a value judgment about myself. I noticed what happened and decided to do something else instead. And that when we do this, it can really be transformative in the way that we talk to ourselves, think about ourselves, and are compassionate toward ourselves. So, the self-compassion. All right, one other, I think, when I've been doing a book study with Lipsky's Trauma Stewardship for a couple of years now, and one of the things that I think people have a strong reaction to, often positive, sometimes negative, is her idea of a plan B. And what she says your plan B is for work, another job. What could you be doing instead? And she says, create a real actionable plan. The plan B isn't like, oh, I guess I always wanted to, like, become a teacher. Like, she's like, that's not helpful to us. Instead, she says, get very detailed. What training will you need? Where will you do it? How much will it cost? How will you pay for it? Where will you apply? What is your expected salary? Can you maintain your lifestyle on that salary? Are you willing to change your lifestyle? And then she says, go literally update your resume so that you are ready to apply for that other plan B tomorrow. And she says, if your job disappeared tomorrow, would you be ready to immediately begin your plan B? And that when we do that, let me see, I can't remember if yes, okay, good. When we do that, she says, it has two positive effects on us that help us more healthfully engage with our current work. She says, one, by having an actionable plan, we create added security. It lowers our anxiety when we know, oh, I have something I know I can do. It is planned out, mapped out, I'm ready to do it. It creates a nice little blanket of security, and that's lovely. But I think often what I hear in the book groups is people talking more and having a stronger positive reaction to point two of, by having a viable alternative, we recognize our freedom and accept the responsibility of continuing to show up to our current job every day. Because Lipsky points out that we often, by these mechanisms, sometimes by these coercive mechanisms that require us to work, and then when we choose to work in a system that's underfunded, under-resourced, understaffed, and we feel like I can never do enough, we very quickly and very often start to feel trapped. We feel like, if I don't do this work, people die. If I'm not there, it doesn't get done. If I'm not there, things fall apart, people are let down, people are disappointed. I have to do it. And we feel trapped. And so when we create that real, strong plan B, and we know I could go do it, and I know I could be helpful in some other way, well, this creates a huge sense of relief, because now I'm choosing to do what I'm doing today. And so if I continue in this job, it's this Sartrean existential thing of like, I am accepting responsibility for the choices I am making every day. And in that, there's relief. Maybe some dread of the responsibility of like, oh God, I'm choosing to do this. But more often, it's a sense of like, oh, I'm choosing this. This is what I actually want. Instead of perceiving ourselves as trapped. Okay, so in summary, exposure to trauma and helping people who've experienced trauma activates our own trauma exposure response. We can become alienated from our reasons for helping, and we need to actively bring ourselves back to those reasons. We need workplaces with structural practices for managing our trauma exposure response. So, what are your questions?
Amelia, I think I might stop recording if that sounds okay for you, in case
Sure.
that might make folks feel more comfortable asking questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. That was so great.